Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our second session of A Talk Around Tuesday, which is about the quiet child. And I'm sure there's many of you sitting there thinking, my child actually isn't quiet, why am I sat here? But actually, I want to look and explore with you some of the elements of the connotations around what we think the quiet child is, and how that transfers to what you think an extrovert and an introvert is, and how that transfers to the classroom and to you at home. As per all of these events, there is a chat function on the right of your screen. Please do ask questions. We've got Sarah Stockdale, Head of Marketing, online this evening, and she will be very happy to ask questions or field the questions along the way. Don't leave it till right at the last minute, because often the questions then fall off the end of the chat. What I do have is a book list, and it's not extensive, of about 4 or 5 books that are quite useful aspects of a little bit of what we're talking about tonight. So if you do want any of those, please do let us know. As per last week, just email Sarah Coleman and she will send you the list on. So the quiet child. Do we look at our children when they're born and think they'll ever be quiet? Probably not. But let's imagine ourselves and whether we think of us, what we think of ourselves and our personality. And so lots of us will have done Myers-Briggs or some sort of personality assessment at some point in our careers, and been told that, oh yes, well, you are an ET, I can't even remember what I am actually, an ESTJ, I think I am. And you think, oh, that means I'm an extrovert in everything I do. And actually, that's not quite the case. And it may well be that you've answered that set of questions in a Myers-Briggs situation, whilst you're at work, on a day that you were quite pushed, and actually that was how you were on that day. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the right fit, but it asks you that same question. The purpose of those Myers-Briggs is that they ask you the same questions in just different ways. So on the whole, they are pretty accurate. But does it mean that it transfers? Is it seen as a negative? And I just want to explore a few of those things tonight. If you think about yourself, how many times as a parent, when your children are little, do you actually go, can you just take the children for a walk, for a treat, to the park for me, just so that I can have some time? I'll defy anyone that's not done that. I'm sure you've all done that. And I certainly did. Certainly when my children were little, and you feel so time deprived that you've not even had the opportunity to go to the shower or to the bathroom by yourself, and you crave that sort of quiet time. It's mixed with, it sounds familiar, that, you know, I need an hour, I need just some time. There's a lot going on there, that you're tired, you feel a bit guilty, but you actually are completely embroiled in that family life emotionally. You're totally emotionally attached. So, you know, when people say, well, just leave them for a little while, it's easier said than done when that's your child that's crying, or has been crying in the buggy for 10 minutes, and because they don't want to get in or out of the buggy or in or out of the car seat. We've all had that situation. And they all point to that same big idea that actually we all need a little bit of quiet time at certain points in the day, in the week, in the weekend. And I know, you know, even now with a 20 and a 23-year-old, only one of whom lives with us, actually just having the house to myself is quite a rare occasion. But when I do, I just love that quiet space. And then little things irritate. So the fan, or the extractor hood fan, or the tumble dryer whizzing round, or the sort of low level buzz that generally hums from any white goods in your kitchen. And those things irritate, and you think, wow, actually, gosh, I'm noticing all of those sounds, and lockdown has been interesting for that, for most of us. If you live with a younger child, I've got an example there of a 7-year-old who could talk for 24 hours straight and rattle and rattle and rattle on and on and on and on. you love the sound of their voice, but actually you need that moment of just clarity of thought. So let's be honest, look at yourself. When we're talking about I've got a quiet child, or my child slopes off and is happy to play alone, also think about the times when you also like that quiet time. So don't think of it as a complete characteristic for the rest of your child's life. And also don't view it as a negative. To the next slide, which is exactly that. Is quiet a negative description? So one of the things that I find when I'm talking to prospective parents, often they'll say to me, if, for example, in the last 12 months, I've been meeting lots of children online, how difficult that is to start to talk to a 5, 6, 7, even 10-year-old on the Teams call. We found it difficult enough. So imagine with them how difficult that is. And so the parent will say, oh, they are quite quiet, so it might be quite shy, so it might be quite tricky. And, you know, no shock Sherlock, it would be very difficult. I mean, if I said to my 20-year-old, can you sit in front of the screen now and talk to somebody that you might go to university with, or you might go to that school, he'd be backing out of the room very, very swiftly. So I think we need to be very aware of what we're expecting them to do. I liken it very much to the fact that if you think, you know, as parents, sometimes we can get a little bit frustrated. You know, when the old spelling tests used to come out and used to think, right, what are they going to get? They're going to get 10 out of 10 today for their spellings. And you just couldn't get it in your head, or times tables. You couldn't get it in your head. You couldn't understand why it was so difficult to spell the word then. Come on. Why can't you spell it? Why don't you end up? And that frustration that we take, because it's an easy spelling for us. We are quite a few years down the line of knowing that spelling and using it. But actually, you try spelling a word like ubiquitous or spontaneous, or actually a word that you don't use all of the time. That's way more tricky. So when we sometimes put our judgments on our children, we are forgetting that they're at the very early learning stage of their oracy, their listening, their receptive expressive language. They're at a very early stage. So when we openly say, oh, actually they're quite shy, put them in a classroom with children or a playground with children where there's a football or Lego, and actually often they're not. So I think we just need to be mindful about how we use it. And I thought actually this brings us on to this kind of introvert extrovert notion. And I thought this paragraph here was a really interesting way of actually being able to separate that. So actually, contrary, it says, you can read it yourself, but contrary to popular misconception, introverts are not shy and extroverts are not necessarily outgoing. Rather, extroverts draw their energy from external stimulation in the world around them, and introverts thrive when they're focused on independent or reflective activities. And these tendencies are that often lead us to such misconceptions. So a simple way of looking at it is that extroverts and introverts define how someone recharges their brain. So you may well thrive on that bouncing of ideas and that brainstorming and that just collectively getting together and really oozing ideas, whereas actually somebody else might go, I need to reflect back, I need some time to think, I need some time to evaluate, I need some time to judge, I might just take a spectator view here. Neither one of those are the right or the wrong way to deal with a classroom situation, a learning environment, or indeed a work environment. So if we, and I often find that we look at the quiet child, we say the quiet child as if that's an issue. And you know it yourselves when you're looking in your workspace. You know, I know in a given workspace, I'll always have that person that says, okay, it's Friday, you know, it's 5 o'clock, are we going to the pub? Or and we'll all, you know, there'll be a group together, and there's always be a few people that slope off and actually don't want to do that, and they can't be blamed for that, the fact that they don't want to be doing that. that's not their thing. That's not what they want to do, and nor should they be persuaded to do it just because it's not them being unfriendly or not being sociable. It's just the way they are. And actually, we're pretty bad at accepting that sometimes. I've really kept these extrovert things very short because obviously I'm really trying to talk today about that child that perhaps the language is a bit later to come, or that shyness is very much evident as soon as they meet anybody outside of their family unit. But managing extroverts, you know, when we're told from a school perspective in education, when we're being trained, how do you manage extroverts? You let them dive right in. You give them the opportunity to put forward all of their efforts and their ideas towards projects right off the bat, right straight away. You encourage their enthusiasm. You let them speak to think. That's how they're thinking. They're speaking out loud. Their cogs are going around as they're voicing it, and it's that speed of thought that, and it often is verbalized without really understanding that anybody, or irrelevant whether anybody else is listening. Often we don't listen to an extrovert who does nothing but chats. Often then they're missed out. We don't listen to them actively enough because we're not, well, we're probably quite exhausted as a listener, but often we're not just taking their chunks of incredible ideas and splitting them off. So often it's about us as a receiver, and certainly us as teachers, where we've got an amazing group of children in one class, 1 year group, and just using that as an example, the teacher is so skilled at listening to those extroverted children who want to add in their points all the time, and a gentle hold on the shoulder, or a gentle "I'm coming to you next, just hold on a second." Those kind of conversations that happen, but it means that everybody is collectively valued, whether you're the quiet person, and that's, she'll question that child a little bit more in alignment with where she knows that they've had some time to think, and she'll then spectate, and then she'll question them. It's really clever work. Let them multitask, because actually often an extrovert wants to pace the room whilst they're thinking, and wants to squish a ball or throw a ball against the wall. Maybe not at home, but that is often what they want to do because they can do that whilst they're thinking. I respect the fact that they've got that independent nature. They're very much their own people. They'll work well in their teams, but they also thrive independently. And let them shine. You know, don't squish that enthusiasm that's in them just because you see them always coming to the table. For the child who's taking longer to come to the table, to put their effort in, sometimes that's frustrating, and we have to manage that at school, and I'm sure you have to manage that at home. When your 2-year-old wants to talk desperately at the table, but they're taking their time to get their conversation out and what they want to tell you, and your 7-year-old wants to pipe in and absolutely finish the whole conversation off for them. It's that patience that is required, particularly when you get 2 children. I've got 2 children at polar opposites, entirely opposite conversationally. One who's much more this quiet child, and one who's much more avert in her conversation. So I have seen it very much firsthand for myself. But looking at now what we call this apologetic way of saying, well, my child is quiet, or how often have you read a report from somebody saying, Alex is a quiet child? I've probably written it myself, but you see often that is taken as a negative, and actually we need to not be seeing that. We need to be thinking, okay, how can I best help them? And it might not be that they want your help at any point, and we're coming on to that in a little while. But this, in terms of how we would manage in a classroom situation and how perhaps you have to negotiate, I can only imagine that in a house with 3 or 4 children and an animal and someone coming and going, that you actually have that negotiating skills required from a team effort. But letting them think to speak, so that child that perhaps is taking a little bit longer, those cogs are turning. They're not turning slower because they're not understanding. they're still turning, they're absolutely understanding just as much as the child who says something spontaneously. They're thinking just as much, their clarity of thought is possibly better, but the way that they understand conceptually is often better too. Just because they're not regurgitating it and showing you that they've understood doesn't mean that they haven't understood. So let them think to speak. They often need a little bit more time to actually evaluate. Give them time to make decisions. I think that's really important. And that, when you're a really quick decision maker, is really difficult. It's that point when you become a little bit impatient, when you're waiting for a decision to be made, and it's not a gut feel decision. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. There's a little bit of going over in their minds, and they're taking their time to have that valued opinion. And sometimes that is frustrating as the listener, but that's about you adjusting, not about them needing to adjust. And respect their private nature. I think this has taken me a long time to actually appreciate this in my own family. So I am ordinarily quite communicative. I like to discuss how the day's gone, and I speak to my mum every night. I speak to my cousins fairly regularly. I am quite a communicator. My son is not at all, and where we completely clashed was the point at which him going off to university was a really good example, where he doesn't feel the need to communicate or over communicate, and I feel the need to check in. And that's a parent-child point of view too, but actually we've had some really good meaty conversations in the last 2 years where he's like, Mum, I don't feel the need. He's not comfortable to talk in a group, and he doesn't feel uncomfortable. He's happy taking in the conversation. He's very happy in his surroundings. He just doesn't feel the need to enter into the conversation, particularly in a bigger group. He's amazing on a one-to-one. He was not always amazing on a face-to-face. So when we got to the point where we were needing maybe difficult conversations around what on earth was that parents' evening about last night, or what on earth were you doing coming in at 2 o'clock in the morning, when we were having those difficult conversations, I never could do that face-to-face with him. He would hate that moment where he was looking at me and I was looking at him. I had to wait until we were side by side. So it might be in the car. We would have those conversations going on a journey, and he coins it the fallow deer moment, actually, and he still says it's the fallow deer moment. There is a cafe in Teddington called the Fallow Deer, and he says that every time I suggest to him that we go to the Fallow Deer for breakfast or for lunch, that is the point at which he's going to get the lecture from me. And that is not strictly true, but he's probably not wrong. But actually being able to understand that he needs that time, that private nature is really important for him. So even when he's home now from university, he will take himself off to his room and he'll play the guitar for 45 minutes, or he'll sit and scroll through YouTube after YouTube after YouTube, or he'll read something, or he'll listen to music. He wants that time on his own. He's not unhappy. And towards the end of this, we're going to talk about that, not about recognizing happiness and quiet. That they're totally different things. Appreciate the need to work alone. So that child in the classroom, Susan Cain is one of the people that writes about this. She talks about the fact that she was very introverted at school and very quiet and very shy. And the thing that she finds herself very frustrated with in life now is this constant need to get together as a group. And we do it all the time. In school situations, you'll say, talk to your partner now, talk to your table, pre-COVID times, obviously, because clearly they're not really that close at this point, but it would be, right, talk to your table of 4 now, come up with some ideas and then feedback. Actually, some children are very happy to be working alone in their thought process and quite crave that, and actually quite want that, to be able to tick that box that outcome has been achieved for them. And it doesn't mean they don't feel left out. That's what they want. And it's about us as in a classroom gauging that, who are those children that actually at times might just want to be left out of the loop of that big group brainstorming. And as adults, it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same premise as I have noted myself. And the carefully listening to them. So I do know that when Noah, my son, speaks, what he tends to say makes perfect sense, is incredibly emotionally intelligent, and is spot on. But you have to catch it. Don't dare try to be idling around whilst he's trying to talk or he's trying to have that conversation, and don't miss it, because he won't repeat it. It's a golden moment. So you have to make sure you, as the receiver, are actively listening. And I think that's what's really important when your children are very little. So often we'll be busying around and we'll be doing things in the house and in the car, or, you know, how often do you actually see people in shopping queues and they're actually on the phones themselves and their child's next to them trying to talk to them or at them or hanging on their legs? And those are the times when we actually, it's us that need to adjust. It's our receptive listening that needs to adjust at that point, and picking up on those moments when actually they're probably not going to talk to you at their 3-year-old friend's birthday party whilst everybody else is running around the church hall, but they will talk to you in bed that evening whilst you're reading a story. And it's about choosing your moments and taking those times to actually eke from those children where they're at. And this is where it's so important to let them get their own pace, and let them take their own gauge, because they're not they're not less academic, they're not less emotionally intelligent. They're exactly the same as that other child sitting next to them, who perhaps is a lot. And also the opposite of that quiet is, are we talking about noisy, or are we talking about loud, or are we doing introvert, extrovert? And I think we need to be really mindful of the language we use around that. So in the classroom, what are we doing? I talk a lot to prospective parents about the need to talk. So I'm sitting here now saying it's absolutely fine if your child doesn't. It's a whole dichotomy in terms, really. But essentially, in the classroom, the drive for talk is actually about that language-rich vocabulary. So it's not about being able to talk on a given subject for 10 minutes non-stop, or present on a TED Talk about dinosaurs. It's absolutely not that, but it's about being able to pick up on that language-rich, and that communication might come through in their writing. It might come through in their they're acknowledging the text that they're reading and the discussions that they might have with you about that. I've got a boy in one of the older years who is fascinating. His domain knowledge, so his knowledge about specific areas of interest, he's got quite a few interests, and his knowledge is incredible. He's not going to want to talk to me about the weather. He probably doesn't want to talk to me about what the latest football scores were. But when we sit in mentoring together and we talk about areas of interest that he's focused on and his incredible language around it, there is no notion that he is the quiet child. He's just talking about his given area that he's very, very comfortable with. And the rest of the time, he'll let someone else take the centre stage. So in the classroom, we're looking for that vocabulary, absolutely right. And it doesn't have to be that they're always speaking it or that they're even always reading that language, but maybe they're listening to it, they're taking it in, they're soaking it up, and it will come in times. How often, when you are sat with your 8-month-old, were you absolutely desperate for them to go dad, 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 or mama, mama, mama? All of us, let's be honest, hand on heart, you wait for that moment. And when your NCT or your health centre friends who are in that same pregnancy stage as you and have had their children exactly the same, you are in competition. There's a mode of, well, hold on, what do you mean they haven't said anything yet? Or what do you mean they haven't spoken? Really? And then the horrific moment when you actually realise their first word is perhaps a word that you wish they hadn't been able to say because they've heard it, you say it, or they've heard you talk it. They will speak when they're good and ready. And actually, on the whole, unless there's a hearing issue or unless there's some language delay, which is often picked up at that kind of 12 to 18 month stage, Ordinarily, they might just take their time and decide to talk all in one go, and lots of children are like that. Just in the same way as they are with walking, that child who is on their bottom shuffling around for months and months and months, and actually just decides one day they'll get up and they'll walk, and they'll probably be quicker than the rest of their friends who have learnt to walk and toddle and fall and not balance. They may well have that balance there. So it is that race that we quite often do, that hare and tortoise, don't we? And it's not dissimilar with the talking, and it's not dissimilar with that frustration of they're so quiet, they won't speak outside of the family zone. And that's often, that might well be to do with not feeling comfortable or being quite shy or being slightly more reserved, and it just might be that you've not quite been talking about something that they're that focused on that they want to join in. So that vocabulary is really important, so soaking them up. And I'm going to show you just a book here that I often use with children who struggle with being able to voice get their vocabulary. You'll have seen them, I'm sure, all in Waterstones Heavy at the moment. There's actually an amazing collection of them, and I've just got no excuse to buy them really, apart from that maybe I make the excuse that I teach. But you've just got a book rich with illustration, and I touched on this in the picture book, Power of the Picture Book last week. You've got a really rich, creative, beautifully illustrated picture. It might just be that your child all of a sudden has got, actually, I've got an interest in sharks, or actually I've got an interest in monkeys. I want to tell you all about every single monkey that I've heard of. And all of a sudden they're off, and you've found that level of interest. It's about that, again, that picture book that we talked about last week, that's the one that they always seem to want you to read. And actually is probably the one thing they always want you to talk about as well. And it's making sure that you pick up on those nuances and let them take off with it. Sometimes it helps to have something to listen to. So an audio book, and you'll hear them repeat the rhyming and repeat the words, and their vocabulary then picks up, and they will then engage as and when they're ready to do so. And the last thing here is the persona. So quite often where a parent comes to me and they're concerned about their child, they're concerned about the sort of communication aspect, and that the fact that their child isn't particularly happy to speak aloud. And, you know, often in children that have some sort of learning enrichment issues, so maybe they're on the autistic spectrum, or they may well be profoundly dyslexic, often that communication is a struggle, and we can give some strategies to help with that. And sometimes it is just actually picking your moment. What I have done in the past with a few children that their parents may well have come to me with a concern about it, and it does tend to be as they get a little bit older that you perhaps start to feel that and recognise the issue with this, is you could advise them to go do something like Lambda or drama, or where they can become something else. Now, one of the most incredible sessions, small group sessions I saw, which was probably 10 years ago now, was with two children. One was an elective mute, so therefore hadn't spoken at all in school. It was a nursery class, and it was with a group of children. One boy who actually found enunciating really difficult and articulating very difficult, but he'd have a good go. They were both painfully shy to talk out to anyone in the class. And I watched a series of sessions with them talking with a facilitator, which is why Lego therapy is always amazing for this as well. Lego therapy, you get given a role, so therefore you're talking about your role that you're building, or you're the creator, or you're the manager of that. So they're given a role, but it's about taking on another persona. It's almost like sitting behind a puppet. So this group session was where the teacher herself had her book in front of her face like this, and she whispered. And she whispered into a little box which was like a shoebox, and she handed the shoebox round, and I thought, falling on deaf ears, I don't think this is happening. I cannot see this working out at all. This is really not doing anything. 3 sessions later, it was amazing. The children were talking into the box because it wasn't going anywhere. It was staying. It was like a book in front of her with a kind of hatch box in behind it, and the voice and the noise wasn't going anywhere. So they were comfortable to be talking into the box, and they passed it around. And forcing it, so if we'd have sat there without any of that, without an aid or something to help us, we could have been sat there for 3 months actually before there was any conversation, before the children were comfortable to have that conversation. So often taking on a new persona, which is why in terms of play, small world play with little figures and little toys and dinosaurs and miniature worlds are so important, because they're capable of moving over to another persona, and it means that they are then able to talk through the eyes of somebody else, and sometimes that's comforting. So often if you're struggling with that and you want to get some, you're concerned, often that small world play is a vital part of that, and I've got lots of resources that you can ask us about if that is a situation. You know, I remember one boy that, in fact, it was that same boy who he was obsessed with JCB diggers, and we got a small world play with a tough tray top with sand in it and gave him 6 JCB diggers. Wow, it was actually quite amazing. It was a talking point, and there's not a lot now I don't know about JCB diggers. All very useful things. But that persona is really interesting, and it's something that sometimes works further up. So the boy that I was just explaining to you about, who's very domain specific in his conversation, he will very happily sit in front of a camera and introduce. So he introduced our talent show for us, and he was very happy to introduce that, because actually he's just taking on another persona, another route, and is very comfortable within that. That last slide is just about why quiet time is important. I think one of the things, if you've seen any work on screens about the damage that screens can do, and let's be honest, we're all on screens all of the time at the moment. But Eric Sigman does some incredible talks around the damage to the brain and the neural paths and the transmitters, and how we become as a nation quite impatient. And I think one of the things that we don't allow ourselves often is that quiet time. And so that opportunity to reflect, that opportunity to actually sit back and evaluate, as I said at the beginning. And one of the key things that, when I looked at some of the research into this some time ago, what I had not really, in my scientific knowledge was lacking clearly, but what I hadn't realised was actually what you're taught in a day in school or at home is made solid in your sleep and your rest periods. So when you're resting in the evening, all of that learning, even if it's not asleep, but you're actually resting, all of that learning that's been going on in the day is being made solid in your brain. And you know, that's often why a child, for example, a child who say has epilepsy and has seizures through the night, they don't have that opportunity for their brain to stop in the evening, because there's electric activity going on all the time. So they don't have that opportunity to stop. So therefore, that learning that has happened in the day does not have time to be made a grounding and a foundation. So I think having that time, and maybe making that time for you as a family, is really important too. In adolescence and further up, those periods of times when we've spoken to the children about, actually, don't you feel a bit more alert when you've not been slumped over a gaming chair, or you've not been sat in front of a screen watching constantly something flicking in front of your face? And actually they have admitted that makes them much more alert with having that opportunity to have that quiet time. Even the younger children would admit that too. I had a really interesting conversation, knowing full well that this was coming up. I had a really interesting conversation with my year threes last week in lessons about what they find, what they do when they feel. We were actually talking about healthy eating and our relationship with food, and I said, well, what do you do to try and make yourself feel less concerned or worried, or you'd hope that at that age they weren't stressed by anything, but what actually do you do? It was amazing the things they did, that they took themselves off. Quite a few of them said, I take myself up to my room, or I go off to play with my Lego, or I go off on the trampoline. They're having quiet periods of time. They need that reflection time. And so the benefits of time are clear. They're clear in every bit of research that you'll ever do on screens and devices and IT. But ultimately, what I sometimes get is a parent really quite concerned by the fact that they feel that their child isn't learning because they are quiet and they are shy, and that isn't the case. Your children are learning, even if they're shy, even if they're introverted, even if they're quiet. It's not a defining factor. One of the other things that then also worries probably parents of older children, then there's a big concern about, and I have to be honest, hand on heart, I have been guilty of this myself. Why doesn't Noah want to come and sit around the table when we're all chatting, we're all doing this, we're all doing that? And actually, he doesn't want to do that because he's just having a quiet period. He's having a quiet 20 minutes to himself, and he's playing the guitar, doing whatever he's doing. And we're not very accepting of that if we're not the same. So it's often about acknowledging that isn't anything to do with that child not being happy. And I think that's where parents often have a slight anxiety around it. So they're not talking, they're really quiet, they're shy, there's something troubling them. Now, of course, we all know that could well be the case, but it definitely isn't always the case. And one of the things that they become very concerned about is my child lonely? Do they not have any friends? Are they just lonely because they don't talk and they don't mix with their friends? And if you ask them, they will probably tell you they're not lonely. They're very content in their own space, in their own time, and in their own framework. They're also very content with their friends. And actually, the absolute epitome of that is when you see two toddlers who don't speak and you see their interaction. They don't need to talk. They don't need to talk to understand each other. Children don't need to talk to play together, to be friends with each other, to acknowledge each other's strengths. They don't necessarily need to talk. So on the flip side, I'm saying to you, please talk to your children as much as possible. Of course I am, because I want that language richness and that vocabulary that's so important. But I'm also saying, please don't stress if actually your child isn't the outgoing one who wants to go to all the clubs after school and wants to play football for the local team and wants to swim in the swimming pool. Don't fret, because actually in time that will come. And it's more about us accepting that as parents and as teachers and adapting our provision and what we do, rather than making a big fuss about it. Often in a bigger family where you sort of you're demanding and craving attention, often that's when that's highlighted, and we just need to make sure that perhaps that child doesn't have to necessarily speak at the table about their day. They may well tell you afterwards when they're helping you stack the dishwasher, or you're putting the bath on later on, and it's just about choosing your individual times with your individual children. So I've completely rattled on about talking and children and quiet, and I haven't had a moment of quiet during that period, so apologies for that. If there are any questions, I haven't got my chat screen up, but I think Sarah is there.
Hi, good evening. No, we do have some questions in for you. Thank you very much. It's very interesting to hear both sides, isn't it? I think of quieter children and actually extrovert children as well. Just to start off, a few questions about what the school does to support children who are quieter in class and who tend not to put their hand up. How do we go about helping to support them, and what provision is in place for them?
So that's quite an interesting question, because actually there is a notion at the moment which lots of schools have trialled about insisting that children don't put their hands up, and actually just saying, no one needs to put their hand up here. We have done an awful lot of work on the Rosenstein principles, which is a method of teaching and a pedagogical kind of belief behind teaching, and it's very much about how you question. So it's really not up to your child necessarily to be desperately in need of putting their hand up. We should be targeting them, asking them the right questions, and that's where you get your differentiation in the classroom as well. So the child that might be really shy to respond in a class, you ask them a question that you know is going to get a high success rate straight away. It's going to be a popular response, and they're going to be absolutely sure they've got it nailed. So you do that first of all, and then it eases them gently in. So we tend to have quite a lot of tricks and ways in which we do that, but it's often around questioning.
Thank you. And how's that worked in the virtual world for the last couple of months then?
Yes, interesting. So I have had that exact conversation with a parent who just said, look, actually, I'm really struggling because I'm listening to my child's lesson and I'm listening to the same little Johnny. We don't have a Johnny, so I'm not speaking of anyone here, but that same Johnny going, oh, what about me, Mrs. Strong? What about me, Mrs. Strong? Oh, I've done this, and it's my birthday tomorrow, and I've got new rabbits. Did you know? And I'm reading a book. And yes, there are definitely ways to manage that. And it's been such a steep learning curve for them in a virtual world, because they've had to appreciate that they need to take their time and they need to wait. So we've done lots of mute, unmute, it's your turn, let's go down the register, let's handpick. So we've had to sort of play games with that as well in a different way, and it's not quite so, it is more difficult virtually, there's no two ways about it, because in a classroom it could often be a non-verbal gesture to somebody, it'll be a hand or just a tap on their shoulder, or even a nod that prompts either the speaker or the listener. So it has been more difficult, there's no two ways about it.
Great, thank you. And just looking at children who act slightly differently within the home environment from the school environment, how do you deal with that, where a child can be quite confident and outgoing at home, but at school the feedback is that they're not very vocal? What can you or we as a school do to help parents in that situation?
So I think one of the challenges here is about actually us as practitioners looking back and evaluating and reflecting. Well, just because that child isn't necessarily vocalizing their understanding, does it necessarily mean that they're not understanding? Not really. And that's really our role to pick that out and to be able to help them, to facilitate them in a group. And also, sometimes when it gets to the stage where we realise it is becoming a barrier, and that's when when it's becoming a barrier to what they're being able to do in the classroom, then you may well start something like a Lego therapy session or give some pointers from a home perspective. They're never going to be, they're always very differently behaved at home than they are at school, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one is the best version of themselves and the other isn't, because let's be honest, how many of us are the same at work as we are at home? Not really very many of us. We adapt to our surroundings. So I wouldn't worry overly. I think where it becomes a barrier is if they're disengaged. So if they're disengaged with their learning and they're quiet and they don't bring up, that's to do with us having to question and pick out the nuances of where their understanding is, which is where we need to head really with that from a lesson point of view.
Great, thank you. And another question along a similar theme about someone's daughter who is joining the school. They're extremely nervous about new situations and people and analyse every situation as far as playing with friends, suggesting new games. You need to stop and think about it beforehand. Is there any way that we can help guide them, or is there any work that we do within the school environment to help them, especially in relationship in this instance, I guess, to friendships, which is quite an important developmental area?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I see at the bottom you've said, I'm not sure if you can call it quiet, but maybe more sort of nervous, and that's quite a few children would have that sort of anxiety. I mean, it is incredible because we often as parents again have that assumption that actually coming to school is definitely going to be a problem. Oh, they're going to really struggle with being in a room with lots of strangers. And it's amazing how often that is not the case. And a parent can go, wow, I just did not expect that. So I think what you need to do is you need to manage your own anxiety around that as well, because let's be honest, we give birth and we're anxious the minute we've done it. So, you know, we're anxious because they don't feed properly, because they don't sleep, because they're not moving, because they're not chatting. So you need to manage that, and it needs to be almost a kind of fait accompli, but we need to manage it alongside with you. So we try, if we are allowed to have you in, we certainly do that. So we'll have a session at Hinchley Wood where we get together as a group and the teacher will be there, and it will be much more social, and it will be out of the school grounds, or we'll have an event here that's a music lesson or a PE session, so that it starts to assimilate as being a normal situation. They also then get a little book with their welcome, and you know, being able to acknowledge who their teachers are, who the adults in their room will be, so that they've got a connection. And we will work with you definitely very, very specifically. It's really important that if they've had those issues at nursery and you find that generally you're going into kind of a swimming lesson or a music lesson or whatever, that we work with you beforehand, because I think it's preempting it, which is really important. And then on the day itself, often it's a kind of fait accompli, and they'll go, we often worry about it far more than they do. And actually what you're describing is somebody who spectates first, and that's absolutely fine. Spectating, as playing in the background, is absolutely fine.
Great, thank you very much for that response. And just moving on to team sports and activities, how do we encourage introverted children to join in with these kind of sport activities, which can often cause anxiety for them?
I think that's really important as well, how we manage that. Certainly at a very young stage, ordinarily we just get them involved in the physical aspects, so the physical development. It might be that they don't necessarily like kicking the ball about, but they may well like climbing the climbing frame, or posting the beanbag into the hoop, or so we try to encourage that as much as possible. And we are very much about sport for all here, so our PE teams at both the girls prep and the boys prep are very much around looking at them from reception and how their physical skills develop. And if we see a point where actually they're struggling to take part, we will engage them in a small intervention or a small group session, so that they start to feel much more comfortable. And let's be honest, we have this expectation that everyone's going to love being on the rugby pitch or on the netball pitch. Everybody doesn't love that. We're all different, but that person may well be an amazing karate student or a jiu-jitsu student. And it's about looking at your individual child and not having that expectation that perhaps we think of as parents originally when we plan our children's lives ahead of them, you know, thinking actually maybe that's not quite right for them at the moment. I often talk to parents who have perhaps put their child into rugby tops, and you know, they're absolutely not interested in it at all, and you know, the ball goes that way and they go this way. Well, actually that comes with time, and you do sometimes, whilst sometimes they need a gentle nudge, work with the school on that, because we can definitely give you that intel as to whether they're sort of biting it from a school perspective, and it usually does happen easier in that situation with a teacher rather than with a parent.
Great, thank you. And just going back to talking about quieter children and how they perceive themselves, what can we do to help children who negatively compare themselves to the more outgoing ones, the ones who tend to come across as being more confident?
So I saw that question. I think that's really interesting, because I don't know whether children compare themselves negatively or adults compare the children negatively. Because on the whole, most children who are quieter or slightly shyer actually don't feel that that's an issue, and don't see that Johnny, who plays next to them, who's much louder, is brighter than them, more exciting than them, has got more friends. They don't tend to see that. But if you're seeing that and you're viewing that, we need to do some work in the background. So we have lots of interventions from a school perspective across both the preps that will involve a small, and it might be a social stories group where you slightly depersonalize the activity or the event that's going on, so helps them start to think of and allowing them to realize actually we're all different, and we very much embrace that as a school as a whole. So it quite often is a parent worrying about that actually, rather than the children themselves.
Great, thank you. I think also it's probably worth mentioning we tend to consider each child as on their own tailored path, don't we? So we don't have comparative data that's shared or tests that are results that are shared in test for a spelling test against children. It's about their own individual path that they've been on.
Yeah, exactly that.
And the last question that we have at the moment, so quickly type away if you have any more that you would like to ask Mrs. Chong this evening. On extroverts wanting to pace the room, squish balls, etc., how can the school create opportunities for those children who find sitting still for a long period of time difficult? And how can we embrace the flexibility which has been possible during home learning?
Yeah, that's so interesting. We had that conversation just today about actually the fact that every time we see the children online, they've got a snack in their hand or they're munching on something, and we're like looking at them going, oh, it's not break time and it's not your lunch time, and ordinarily at school you wouldn't be eating. What on earth's going on? So we think there will be a slight adjustment for sure on that. We do encourage them to get moving as much as possible. So there are always opportunities. Quite often in a standard lesson, there'll be a retrieval at the beginning. There's a kind of a knowledge gathering retrieval part of the lesson, and that might be just a short, sharp 10 question starter, and then they get around and do move, and then they'll move on to a different aspect of the lesson. So there are lots of opportunities, and we're very, very sure about the fact that sitting for 2 hours or an hour and a half in front of a desk with a piece of paper and a pencil does not suit actually any of us. And so there is lots of group opportunities, there's lots of individual work going on, and there's lots of opportunities to mix between doing it on the iPad, doing it on paper, doing it together, and that is the whole point of a strong teaching body, really, that making sure that they stay. And your fiddling thing, come on, how many of us? I sit here in meetings all day long and I'll doodle, and I will be fiddling with my pen, or I'll be tapping my foot. We're not dissimilar, let's be honest, and so some are worse than others, and we embrace that and try to give them something that might help them along the way, and we will work with you on that as well.
Great, thank you. That's the last of the questions that we have.
Well, what I'm going to do, if there are any questions that come in at this point, please just feel free to email them to the same email address that you had the link sent to you. I know that John, who runs our live events, is probably thinking, come on Tracy, it's time to wrap it up because I've got an event in 4 minutes time. And so therefore I am going to love you and leave you at this point and say thank you so much for joining us tonight. If there is anything that you're concerned about with your child joining the school, I know Miss Stewart at the girls and myself here will always take a call, an email, a Teams call, just to have that discussion before they start. So please don't feel concerned. We certainly don't want any anxiety over the summer period before they start school. So please do get in touch with us if you're at all concerned. Enjoy your evening. And John, I have managed to turn off before 7 o'clock. Thank you very much for joining us.